stories do more than anything is capture a mood, capture a sense of the people, of the society. So I don't think they actually have to be nailed to any strict factual and historical accuracy to serve a useful purpose.
And I suppose many very good and effective myths historically have been precisely so effective because they have had very little purchase on reality. Many of the kind of allure of that is quite useful.
I should say, if I may, that there has to be a kernel of truth there. There has to be something at the core, which is then built on, and other stuff comes along and attaches to it. But it does not have to necessarily be 100% pure and accurate in order to be both valid and useful.
I think, and to give one example of that, and I would agree with what you're saying there, is this story about the kind of welcoming, non-racializing character of Scottish nationalism, the idea that we're kind of civic nationalists and that Scottish nationality is accessible to people who are not just white. Now, actually, yes, we have racism in Scotland. Yes, we have problems with racist incidents, but it's important to keep hold of the idea that what we want for our nationalism, what we want for our identity is a non-racializing, non-racist, non-ethnic way of thinking about it. I think that's both sort of empirically false if you look at the racial statistics, we have problems in this area, but also an aspiration which is really, really good and important to uphold despite the lack of absolute uniform observance of its principles.
I think you mentioned, you hit upon an important word there, aspiration. Our stories, perhaps the reason that they can't be 100% factually and historically accurate is that to serve a purpose in society, they must be aspirational. And forming something aspirational out of these stories that makes them useful.
If I can just move us on to another aspect of this. There's been another kind of discussion growing up around this, and there's been lots of articles written about it, with this idea of actually people going out and celebrating our death. Which is like people say, I've never seen anything like it before, and then other people posting things online from when Michael Foot died and the right having a party and all kinds of abuse and people accusing each other. There's no decorum on either side. But then there's other stuff, well, do you think when Ceausescu was killed, in fact, there wasn't a party in Romania and so on? Did you find this unseemly? Did you find it understandable? Did you partake in it? I don't know. How did you go with that, Peter?
My attitude to that is that it takes all sorts. And some people, different people react in different ways. I won't criticise the people who celebrate her death. It's just not something that I would choose for myself. My first reaction on news of her death was to set up a Facebook page, No State Funeral for Thatcher, because the one thing that I was more concerned about, rather than celebrations of her death, was a celebration of her life and a retelling, a rewriting of the history of that time. And my goodness, we've seen that happening in the last few days.
A funny one I saw, I'll come to you, Andrew, in a second, but a funny one I saw was someone said, you can't celebrate this, you must remember that she's someone's grandmother and someone's wife, although they didn't write someone's son, because I don't think an appeal to helping out Mark Thatcher would be very, very popular. But Andrew, what did you make of it?
That's Sir Mark Thatcher to you, a hereditary baronet, thanks to the wonders of the British honour system. I'm not very reverent as a human being, so I don't find it very easy to be offended by things in general. So I don't necessarily... I'm not a very good candidate for condemnation of people having little parties. I thought if you saw the footage of them, they were quite interesting because there were an awful lot of young folk, particularly the ones you saw in Glasgow as well. Though, I mean, there were folk of a certain age as well, but there was an extent to which the press, I think, slightly drove some of these phenomena that you saw, all this kind of interest on Twitter and things about, are you aware of any parties, and can we send our video cameras along to interview to justify your outrageous activity? And so there was a certain sense to which actually I think the press were quite keen that they produce a small crowd of people and point a camera at anybody, and they're going to make a big ballyhoo about it. They're going to show off, and it felt quite a lot like that to me. I mean, I have friends who believe and are of the generation under Thatcher, who believe fervently, and I think with good reason, that the results of Thatcher's policies were the deaths of their friends, their neighbours, and their colleagues. Now, that seems a very stark kind of claim to make, but actually, for many people in very impoverished communities, the cumulative effect of that period in our political history was very, very grim indeed. And I think this idea that there's compulsory grieving and sorrow for everyone, any discordant voice, is somehow outrageous. Now, if I died, and one of the reasons why I don't like funerals is because everybody feels the need often to just speak well of the dead. And frankly, if I live a life which is blameless, without critique, which produces no enemies, in which everybody thinks I'm just a rare character, I think that's outrageous and dismal. I don't want to die that way. I don't want to live that way either. So I think it's very prim and kind of tedious, actually, this kind of desire for this very, very controversial woman who thrived in controversy, who loved her enemies, who felt very empowered by them. The idea that we bury her with all reverential ceremony, is just, to me, very unfaithful to her memory, if I can put it that way.
That comes to the point about state funeral or semi-state funeral or not quite, and I'm sure we all saw Frankie Boyle's joke, which I thought was rather funny. I don't know if you caught that, Andrew. Peter?
I didn't. What did he say?
He said it'll be the first 21-gun salute where they actually shoot the coffin to make sure she's dead.
Oh dear, I suspect that's probably not true. I mean,
Sorry, Peter, what do you think about the state funeral or the almost state funeral?
I think we can always trust Frankie Boyle to come up with the bon mot. He does it regularly. The first thing I have to say is that it is a state funeral. They've managed to deceive a lot of people simply by changing the name and calling it a ceremonial funeral instead of a state funeral. But the fact is, it's a state funeral in all but name. I've challenged numerous people to list for me the significant differences between a state funeral and what is actually happening, and nobody has been able to list any differences at all. So it's a state funeral, and I think people are entitled to be very angry about that.
If you saw what Ken Loach said about it, I thought he was very funny. He said, let's privatise her funeral, put it out to competitive tender and accept the cheapest bid. It's what she would have wanted.
I'm sure Hayek is a bit in the road to serfdom about the perils of a public sector funeral. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be very unattractive for those of us that find that aspect of British pomp, pageantry, and militarism, or the imperial funeral, as I think Peter Oborne called it. I think it will, as Peter was saying, get the backs up of various people. It may politically also not be a terrifically good idea, because although the ranks of the backbench Tories, the ones that weren't guilty for her assassination, may think that the sainted Margaret is held in reverential memory, I'm not entirely sure from the sort of detoxification strategy that David Cameron has attempted to embark on, that sort of wrapping themselves in a sort of Thatcherite neo-Falklands pastiche will necessarily go down terribly well with much of the public.
Someone tweeted, is Blair going to have an Iraq-themed funeral?
But it's just, I mean, I thought it was, like many people, I saw that and I thought it was a joke. And actually, I think overall that the Falklands conflict is something which I'd probably be willing to defend as a piece of military activity. But I just think the sort of the thought, really, of sort of the serried ranks of military personnel trooping along is just the kind of image of this sort of British imperial legacy, which just makes my heart sink, I'm afraid.
It makes my stomach jump. I don't know what you think, Peter.
Makes my stomach churn. I think the very last thing that we in general need is another heavy dose of banal British nationalist jingoism. But unfortunately, the British state sees it differently, and they'll latch onto any excuse for another bit of what's it, pomp and pageantry, as Andrew put it. Can I just pick up on something that was said earlier, Michael, about young people because Andrew mentioned this, that there were some young people protesting Thatcher or celebrating her death. And I've seen quite a lot of criticism about that. But I got a message yesterday from a young friend of mine, early 20s, and he was quite angry about this. Because his point was that just because you're young doesn't mean to say that you aren't knowledgeable. You may not have experienced it directly, but you may know quite a lot about it through education and through talking with parents, grandparents, uncles, etc. So I don't think this criticism of young people is entirely valid. They may know exactly what it is that they're protesting against.
Another little interesting part of this was that the debate or the tribute act in the Parliament after Churchill died was only 45 minutes, but for Thatcher they did 6 or 7 hours or something. And I was just interested in what this says about us as a society. The fact that, have we all become so much more sentimental? Or back in the day, did people just get on with it more? Or were there other motives for this? What do you think, Andrew?
I think it's probably a case of a Tory exorcism going on. I mean, one of the funny things about the Conservatives who've been condemning people who have been celebrating or being less than flattering about Margaret Thatcher on her demise is that you sort of rather forget that it was them that sort of rather ruined her life. It was them that evicted her from Downing Street, that wouldn't support her in the Parliament. And I think for maybe the older generation of MPs, she looms very large, but for their newer generation of Tory MPs, she is this sort of warrior queen figure, a sort of mythic, foundational character in a way that perhaps she isn't for David Cameron. I'm not sure if that's true, but maybe she isn't to the same extent because he's not perhaps a Thatcherite in that mode, and certainly doesn't sound like her. So I wonder if 6 hours or 7 hours, and maybe about double that if we include the House of Lords, which undoubtedly went on for its own length of time, that is this sort of maybe a way of extirpating the guilt of expiating the past sins of having evicted the dear lady from her favourite house, number 10 Downing Street.
Well, Peter said Boadicea, and you said this mythical goddess figure. So, Peter, what did you make of that?
I would go along entirely with what Andrew has said, and the only thing I would add to that is the observation that, as far as I can recall, the Churchill debate on his death was not televised. And that makes a significant difference. There was a big opportunity here for people to be, especially in the Tories, but also in the Labour benches, to be seen to be saying the right things to Middle England. And of course, there was, again, it's the banal British nationalist jingoism, and a chance to get that on TV. A lot of wee sound bites in there to be picked up by the TV stations.
It's an interesting point. Instead of a tribute, it was a party political.
Yeah, to a large extent. Yeah.
Did you see Glenda Jackson?
Yes.
I don't think they'd planned on Glenda Jackson or Angus Robertson for that matter.
Oh, I didn't see him. What did he say?
He was restrained but pointed. The memorable phrase from his speech is never forget, never forgive.
Ooh.
A Christian sensibility, that certainly. I think though I have a certain amount of sympathy though for the reasons that Peter was saying there, for the kind of quivering ranks of the Labour Party here, because it is a publicly exposed event that they couldn't avoid the party political thing. So it's like it was always going to be a question about, did Ed Miliband strike the right note? Did he offend Middle England? Because that's the fixations of the Westminster press. So in the sense, it was always going to be difficult for, I think, the Labour leadership, whatever your Glenda Jacksons might say, in order to sort of pitch the tone right one way or the other. It was that kind of public exposure makes it quite different from, as you say, this kind of pre-televisual era where actually what you see in the House of Commons is a very good way of making sure that nobody ever finds out about it,
Well, speaking as someone who's never really had a problem with offending Middle England, we'll move to our next topic, which is about someone taking serious offence this week, and some lawyers' letters that were sent and some websites that have been sort of temporarily closed down. So I suppose, Peter, because your Twitter went offline for a while, what can you tell us about it? I know there's legal issues, so tell us what you can.
Since discovered that it wasn't actually my Twitter